Today we're going to be expanding on what we did the last lesson, which was direct variation, and we're going to be looking at partial variation. So let's take a look at this example. A banquet hall charges $200 for the room plus $50 per person. We're going to complete a table, a graph, and an equation. So this will just be like last day. And we first have to figure out which one is the dependent variable and which one is the independent variable. So again, the first thing you need to figure out is what the rate of change is. So rate of change is where you see the word per. So right there. And it may not be the word per, it might be for each or something like that. But there is the rate of change right there. So the dependent and the independent variable are in the rate of change. So one variable is the amount of money, and the other variable is the number of people. So then you ask yourself, which one is dependent, which one is independent? Does the amount of money depend on the number of people, or does the number of people depend on the amount of money? So it should be that the amount of money depends on the number of people. And what you'll actually find is that the dependent is always the first variable, and the independent is always the second variable when it's written out as a rate of change. But in the table of values, the independent variable comes first. So this is the number of people, and the dependent is the charge, how much they charge, and the units is dollars. So the units for the independent is the number of people, don't just write people, and the units for the charge is dollars. So now what we need to do is to figure out what the charge is for each of those number of people. So the charge becomes $50 per person, so it's $50 times the number of people, but it is also $200 just for the room. So if there was no people, you would still be paying $200 for the room. If there were 5 people, it's $50 times 5 people plus $200 for the room, which is $450. If there were 10 people, it would be $50 times each of the 10 people plus $200 for each of the room, and that makes a total of $700. Now you can continue to do this work for each of these rows. But one thing that we want to remember, just like direct variation, partial variation will form a straight line, which means the first differences in these numbers will be equal. And if you remember, the first differences is what do these numbers go up by each time. So each time these numbers go up by 250. So 250 add 250. So that means the first differences is $250. So if you were to continue to add $250 each time, you can shortcut what you do on the table, and the next number would be 950. The next number would be 1200, and then 1450, and then 1700. So that's how you complete the table. So independent variable in the first column, dependent variable in the second column. Now, to make the graph, you want to put the independent variable on the x-axis. So that would be number of people. And I'm going to make my scale, so 4 squares is going to be 10 people, and then 20, and then 30. And then your dependent variable, which is the charge in dollars, make sure you put the units, is on the y-axis or the vertical. And I'm going to make my scale, 2 squares is going to be $400. You want to remember that your graph should take up at least 2/3 of the grid, so set your scales appropriately. And then the title of the graph should be whatever the dependent variable is, which is charge, and then versus, and then the independent variable, number of people. Now, because the scale is kind of big, it might be hard to figure out exactly where to put numbers like 450 or something that doesn't land on a nice, easy line. So you want to remember that these will form a straight line. So what I suggest doing is putting the first value down, which is at 200, and then finding some other point that is a nice, easy point to find. For instance, for 20 people, it's $1,200. So that's another nice, easy point to find. Then, since you know this is going to form a straight line, use a ruler, of course, and draw a straight line through those 2 points. And then every other point that should be on that graph will be on that graph. So that's how you make the graph. Now, to make the equation, again, you have to define your variables. So our 2 variables were the number of people and the charge. So we are going to put maybe something like n equals the number of people. It does not matter what letter you use. You can even use x. Some people just use the x for the independent and the y for the dependent. But a lot of times we want to use a letter that kind of represents what it's saying. So n for number, or you could say p because it's number of people. That is the independent variable. And your dependent variable is the charge. So we're going to let c equal the charge. And for each of these, you need the units. And you make the equation just the way you did this math. We took the rate of change, we multiply it by the number of people, and then we added this extra $200, which we call the initial value. If you remember that from back when we did patterning, that was the initial value. So it's the rate of change times the number of people plus the initial value. So to get the equation, it is the rate of change, which is $50, times the number of people plus the initial value. So this here is the dependent variable. This here is the independent variable. This 50 is the rate of change. And the 200 is the initial value. That's how you make the equation. So just a few things to go over. A partial variation is a linear relationship, just like direct variation, but it also produces a perfect correlation, which means the point goes through all the lines. But the difference is the graph does not start at the origin. So the graph does not start at the origin, meaning there is an initial value. So you can see that right there. The rate of change is the value in the problem that refers to the value of the dependent variable per the independent variable. And the initial value is the amount at which the dependent variable starts, or the value of the dependent variable when the independent variable is equal to 0, which we found was that $20 right here. So just like a scatter plot, the independent variable is in the first column and goes on the horizontal axis. The dependent is on the second column and it goes on the vertical axis. And the title is dependent versus independent. And to make the equation, you have to include your let statements, and it's in this form. So D stands for the dependent variable, M stands for the rate of change, I stands for the independent variable, and B stands for the initial value.